Hey, it's Dr. David Phillips. Welcome to this episode of the Phil Files Christian Edition, where we look at the lectionary texts for the upcoming week. Thanks for joining. Hope you enjoy it today. Hey, welcome to the Phil Files Christian Edition, the lectionary, the week of January 29th, 2023. Hope you're doing well. Today, we are going to look at the lectionary text, the gospel text from the Gospel of Matthew. It's a familiar text for you, for many of you. It's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. It's the Beatitudes, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation. We'll get into that, and then just have a discussion about what Matthew and through his writing is trying to portray, trying to connect to the people and what he's trying to communicate through the text. So, Matthew 5, first 12 verses. One day, as he saw the crowds gathering, Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them. God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. Be happy about it. Be very glad, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. Now, the point that I want to kind of jump on and hold on to a little bit in this, and this is a lot of how I would preach it, is this idea of the mountain. In Matthew, Jesus' presence on a mountain signals a bunch of different things. It was on a very high mountain that Satan promised to give Jesus the kingdoms of the world if Jesus would just worship him. This passage, the first two verses, he goes up on the mountainside. It anticipates the fact that he would often withdraw from the crowds to pray by himself. That's in chapter 14, I believe. It would, on the mountain, he had, the powerful transfiguration. And then obviously he was crucified on a mountain. And then the eschatological discourse, toward the end of Matthew, the chapters 24 and 25, those occur on the mountain, and Jesus is, again, he's seated and he's addressing his disciples. And then after his resurrection, he meets those remaining 11 disciples on a mountain. And they worship him, and they get that famous, go ye therefore and teach all nations. And so it's a set apart place where people go to meet God and to receive instruction, teaching, and commissioning. Now, obviously the mountain in the Old Testament, it has Old Testament implications as well. the obvious connection is between Jesus and Moses, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes. But Moses, he went up on Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments, not once but twice. He saw the promised land from the mountain in Deuteronomy, and then the Psalms has multitudes of ideas about and references about the mountain. It was the dwelling place of God. It was the site of Israel's king. And then in the prophets, according to Ezekiel, God's glory left the temple and it comes to dwell on a mountain. In Zechariah 14, it anticipates that God is becoming king over all the earth and reigning over the Mount of Olives, reigning from the Mount of Olives. And so you have this picture in Matthew of the mountain being a place of where people go and meet God, where they go and get their identity, where they go and get their instruction, where they go and get their commissioning. And then you pull in those Old Testament references, which Matthew often does, and you get this picture of God reigning on the mountain, of the law on the mountain, the looking into the future from the mountain. And so there's so much to think about in terms of the mountain. My personal thought on this is that what we have here is we have, as it has lined up in Matthew, you have Jesus taking over the message of John the Baptist. He's preaching the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. He's gone through the temptation, so now he is this, and passed with flying colors. So he did what Israel could not do, and so he is the Israel encapsulated in one being, in one person. And then you have him coming and sitting down on the mountainside and starting to teach. And that image, that picture, this text sometimes gets paired with the Exodus 19 passage of Jesus going up on Moses going up on the mountain to get the Ten Commandments, or Exodus 19 and 20, to get the Ten Commandments. And the imagery that's created by Jesus going up on the mountain and then his followers getting these Beatitudes is far too coincidental for me. And even the number of Beatitudes, there are 9 listed, but I almost think there are 10 when you get down to verse 12. Be happy about it, be very glad, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. This idea of persecution. So there's 9 side of persecution, but I think verse 12 almost hints at this idea of a reward. We'll talk about that. We'll touch on that in a minute, but the way I would teach this, way I would preach this, is because of the imagery from the Old Testament, because of the imagery in Matthew, This is God handing down a new law. The Ten Commandments were great. They were important. They need to be in your life, Israel. I am not abolishing them. I'm not putting them away. They are the framework, the guardrails for life in general. It doesn't matter if you're a believer in God or not, if you're a Christian or not, or even if you believe in some other deity. Those 10 Commandments have value even for today. And Jesus even said, I didn't come to do away with the law, but to fulfill it. And so I don't see this as Jesus doing away with the 10 Commandments. I think this is as much Jesus explaining a lot of the 10 Commandments in a real practical nature and practical form. And he does that all through the Sermon on the Mount. But this is Jesus going up on the mountaintop to deliver that new law, to start that new law, to begin to communicate what it looks like to live in the kingdom of heaven. And so everything that follows explains the law of God that is written not on tablets but in our hearts. I heard a sermon this week. They were talking about, you had the 10 Commandments, and then you had those, you kind of had the oral law or those 613 individual items that were developed and maintained through culture and experience, and that the Pharisees used to really keep people in bondage. I liked the way the pastor expressed it, that they were it's like saying instead of saying, it was like saying darn instead of the other word. And that they didn't want you to say darn, because if you said darn, then eventually you're going to say the other word. And so those 613 laws were kind of like that. I don't see that as gateway, these laws is anything tied to gateways, because those were more thou shalt nots. This is what you do. I'm reading a book, or I've read a book called Getting It Done. It's I think it came out last year. There's the book. It's by an Israeli, a Jewish lady named Eilert Fishbach. She teaches at the University of Chicago. And she talks about do versus do not goals. And one of the things she says is do goals, also known as approach goals, because they identify a desirable state that we're approaching, pull us toward eating healthily or playing well to win the game. Do not goals, also known as avoidance goals, push us away from the state we wish to avoid. These are essentially anti-goals. When we define our goals as approach goals, we move toward those goals, decreasing the gap between us and our desires. When we define them as avoidance goals, we move away from anti-goals, widening the gap between us and the outcomes we want to avoid. Just as framing your goal as a means or too concrete is likely to make your goal feel like a chore, framing it as an anti-goal is likely to do the same. And this is kind of the key point. Suppression is notoriously hard to do. The more you're determined to not think about something, the more you'll find yourself obsessing over it. A deliberate attempt to suppress certain thoughts makes them more likely to surface. And that's true. I did this experiment on the church I was pastoring recently. And I said, I don't want you to think about a zebra. Don't think about a zebra. Don't think about their stripes. Don't think about are they a white with black stripes or black with white stripes. Don't think about a zebra. And a couple of times during the message, I actually asked, are you still thinking about that zebra? And someone said, I can't get it out of my head. And that's the truth. When you are told not to think of something, that too often is what your brain focuses on. And the Pharisees had created this idea of thou shalt not. Don't work. Don't even touch money on the Sabbath, for instance, because if you don't touch money, then that means that you're not working. Because if you work or do business, if you do business don't do business on the Sabbath, and if you don't touch money, then you're not going to be able to do business. So just don't touch money. You can't spit on the ground because spitting on the ground makes mud, and that's work, and you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Those kinds of things. So a bunch of thou shalt nots, a bunch of do nots. The problem is if we spend all of our time trying not to do something, then that idea is in our head so often that it becomes so easy to actually do. So the idea is to change the focus and have do goals, have do ideas, have do thoughts. And so Jesus is not here giving a bunch of thou shalt nots. He's not here giving you even think about the Ten Commandments. They're do ideas, they're do priorities, they're not do nots. And Jesus is on the mountain, and he's got his disciples in a very rabbinic fashion, and he begins to teach them. And again, based on the imagery from Exodus 19, based on the imagery throughout the Old Testament in the Psalms and Zechariah and Ezekiel on the temple of God being on a high mountain, the king rules on a high mountain, and then you kind of follow that again into Matthew, and the Matthew's understanding of the mountaintop. This is God giving his new law. And it's beautiful. The mountain place is where we go to meet God, where we go to get instruction directly from God. It's the mountain is where we have identity change. We talk all the time, the religious lingo is a mountaintop experience. Why? Because that's where you met God. It doesn't have to be you don't have to go on a mountain, but a mountaintop experience. But there is something about being on a mountain, at least for me. I love the mountains. This is a mountaintop experience that Jesus and his 12 apostles and many of those who were in the early stages of following him experienced. He goes up on top of the mountain, and his disciples and the people following him, his followers, go up on this mountainside with him. And there they meet God. And not only do they meet God, they get the new law. And that new law is a series of do's. Not necessarily do nots. But they all start with the Beatitudes. Now, here's what fascinates me about the Beatitudes. There's really no way to group them. I shouldn't say there's no way to group them. There's not an easy way to group them. But it is an expression of how people are to live in the new kingdom of God. So you have the new kingdom of God requires a new law. Now, you can kind of group these. The first three blessings, which are in verses 3 through 5, you have kind of the middle four, verses 6 through 9, and the final two, verses 10 to 12. But they all, except for the final two in verses 11 and 12, follow a similar structure. Jesus identifies the conditions or the behaviors as blessed, and then he provides an explanation for that. So God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. And you kind of get that picture. It's God blesses, or this is the condition, this is behavior. God blesses that condition or behavior, and then why? The kind of the result of what that looks like. And so the first three blessings, again in verses 3 through 5, they name those who are special recipients of God's favor. The qualities of people that are special recipients of God's favor. They're not in positions of power because they're poor, and they realize their need for him. They mourn, and they're humble. So these are not people who are exalted, who are scribes or Pharisees or religious leaders. They're not political leaders. They're not necessarily business leaders per se. These are people who have limited positions, who are not in positions of power. They don't have prestige. They don't have worldly favor. They're people in the margins. They're the outcasts. They're the people who are broken. They are people who are needy. And these are people that often get taken advantage of. Whether it's economically, religiously, socially, they get taken advantage of. And yet, God exalts them. God says these are people who are blessed and honored. The middle four blessings, verses 6 through 9, God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice. God blesses those who are merciful. God blesses those whose hearts are pure. God blesses those who work for peace. These are practices that embody the hope for kingdom of God. This is what people of God, these are the actions and the behaviors of those who are in the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. They're merciful. They seek justice. They are pure, have integrity, and they work for peace. They have a single-minded authenticity. And those people help shape and help bring about, partner with God to bring about the kingdom of heaven. Their practices, valid, literal practices that people of God who are living in the kingdom of heaven exhibit. These are the kinds of practices that God calls for in the Old Testament. Micah 6:8. We all, what does God demand for you? To do justice, to love people, and to walk humbly with God. That's one of the lectionary texts for this week. The other, Psalm 15:2-5, expands on that. This is what fruits of people living in the kingdom of God have. And that's why the kingdom of God is here. It's today. It's not in the future. It's not heaven. The kingdom of God is alive here on earth. The final two blessings speak of what happens when we adopt those practices and we have those qualities. In verses 6-9. God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. So God blesses people who are merciful, who have an authenticity, who seek justice and who strive and work for peace. God blesses those people, even though you get lied about, mocked, persecuted, treated horribly. God will bless you. The same for verse 12. That there's a great reward that's waiting for you in heaven because of the persecution that you've undergone and endured. And so this new law gets instituted as Jesus begins to describe behavior that exists in the kingdom of heaven. This is the nature and character of true disciples. They're radical. They're contradictory to what the world says. They don't make sense in many cases. But it's the character and nature of people who follow Jesus and live in the kingdom of heaven. And so again, the mountaintop is where people go to meet God, to have their identity formed, to have their instruction met, to be able to look into the future and see what God is bringing about, to get their commissioning, to go into the nations, and to understand how they live in a new kingdom. It's a new law for a new kingdom. And it starts by meeting the king of the kingdom on the mountain. And it's a beautiful story. And it's one that I think can be preached and communicated in a way that changes the the perspective of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So I hope this helps you. I hope this is good for you. And I'd love to know in the comments if this makes any sense to you, what your thoughts are on this. And I appreciate and read all of them. Listen, thanks so much. We'll see you next week as we continue on the lectionary text. Take care.